Welcome, friends. Dr. Grant Wiedenfeld here, and I am in the weeds trying to understand Aristotle's Poetics. This is the first of two lectures. I'm going to give some background here and then go over the kind of definition of terms that starts out the book. So I'm working from the Anthony Kenny translation. This is a book about 330 BCE. It's really lecture notes, like a lot of these old books. Aristotle founded a school, and so he would have had notes for lectures in there. Where does he fit overall? Okay, he's in this period of classical Greece from 510 to 323, really the height of Greek learning, democracy in Athens, and it's also kind of imperial growth. He was, of course, a student of Plato, which I'll get to in a second. So a generation after him. But both Plato and Aristotle, you see they come about at least 100 years after the main literary and dramatic figures in Greek culture. So Homer, much earlier, the poetry from 800s, 900, although it talks about something even older back in the 1300 BCE. And then you have this period of classical tragedy in the 400s, really, and that's kind of the background for Aristotle, and in the same way that if he's writing about film and cinema in the 21st century, there was a whole century and more of cinema that came before him. As far as his life, he is not from Athens, but was from Macedon or Macedonia. Sorry, it's misspelled there, which is a northern part of this area, near what's Thessaloniki today. So you see Athena or Athens in the middle. You kind of go across the bay there, you'll see Thessaloniki. And his father was a physician or medical doctor to the king. And that's significant in kind of his approach, this background of medical family. So they sent him to school down in Athens. Leading academy would have been Plato. Here's a picture, and then he left Athens after college, which I'll get to in a second. But then he came back again in 335, and spent about 10 years there, where he founded his own school. Of course, Plato had the academy. He found his school, the Lyceum, and then it kind of evolves into the Peripatetic school. So this, the picture here is a Renaissance painting, and the two men in the center are Plato and Aristotle, who were, kind of their icons for classical Greek thought and philosophy. Now, after he had been at the academy, he went to the island of Lesbos. Yes, the name is what lesbian is derived from, but his research there was on botany and zoology. And just across it's an island just off the shore of what's now Turkey, and the other side of the Aegean Sea. These are areas colonized by the Greeks, and his father-in-law, he marries a woman there whose father-in-law rules Atarnius on the mainland. And then the next important phase in his life is that he goes back to Macedonia. Of course, he's from a aristocratic family connected to the king. Instead of being the doctor like his father was, now he's going to be the tutor for kind of the royalty, and his most famous pupil is Alexander the Great. Now, Aristotle's work is very important in, you know, Byzantium, Constantinople, you know, which city that becomes Istanbul, and it's through there that he has a major influence on Islamic theology, and it's through Islamic theology that he will come back to Europe in the 14th century with Thomas Aquinas, and you know, some of the late scholastics, the scholastic thinkers who are interested in logic are influenced by Aristotle, and then of course the Renaissance that I mentioned earlier. This book that we're going to focus on, he wrote in kind of all areas of philosophy as well as kind of natural science. He's a real polymath. He's the first one to write, at least in this kind of Greek tradition, a text devoted entirely to the philosophy of beauty, thinking about the arts, and specifically, you know, criticism of drama and literature. Now, there was a part on comedy that was lost, which is a real tragedy that the treatise on comedy was lost. Okay, so let's get into the text, which starts out trying to just explain what it's talking about. It's real scientists. Okay, this is what I'm going to talk about. Let me first give you a definition of what it is. And he's going to define poetry in a way different from what you think of poetry as. It was different from the common word today. Maybe it would be better to use a different word, but nevertheless, this is the one that's being used. So he says epic poetry and tragedy are forms of representation. Now, representation. The word in Greek here that's you'll often find or hear is mimesis. Translated as representation, can also mean imitation. You see the word mime in there, so miming, imitating, and this is in a way, you know, what is happening in stories. It's the story itself is an imitation of, you know, the actual life. It's an imaginary world that's imitating the actual world. And he really sees this kind of imitation as the origin of where poetry comes from. He talks about this as kind of a natural phenomenon. In a section later, he says, representation comes naturally to human beings from childhood, and so does the universal pleasure in representation. He says, isn't that interesting that you can see something horrible, you know, painful thing like corpses or revolting animals, but if you see a picture of them through imitation, there's pleasure involved. You know, so his point is that this is a some sort of natural origin, something specific to the human, you know, the Homo sapiens, which is different than philosophy in this is sapientia, knowledge. So there's another thing that he says is unique to humans, and that's this storytelling and the pleasure that they get from hearing stories or seeing things acted out. All right. Now, in the second section, he starts to define different kinds of poetry, or different differences in medium. And this part is really interesting because he's saying that there's this difference here in rhythm, language, and melody. And it's not that those three things are different arts, but that dance is pure rhythm. Music is a combination of rhythm and melody. Poetry is a triple combination of rhythm, melody, and language. Basically, poetry is dance, music, and language and story being acted out. And this makes sense when you think of movies, especially if you think of opera or plays. There are dance elements of rhythm. There's also melody, music, and so forth. So again, you know, poetry here is not doesn't have the same meaning as today. Notice how logical this is. Uh, there's a he's basing these things on this kind of logical scheme, and in fact, he says that poetry is not based on verse. It isn't poetry because it rhymes or because it is written in a meter like iambic pentameter. He says no. Um, the kind of poetry that he's talking about, this is the different meaning, is stories that are being either told or acted out. It's also difference in how today you might say, oh, dance is the art of the body, music is the art of sound, poetry is the art of language, and those would be three, totally separate things. He doesn't see it that way based on the medium. He sees these different levels synthesized here. So it's an interesting system. Okay, now he says you can also think of, very logical again, different kinds of objects. This is going to come back multiple times. The actions of the people represented. This is how you get the difference between tragedy and comedy in the big sense. In that tragedy is the representation of people as better than people nowadays are. So tragedy is about people who are more ideal that you admire. Comedy is about people worse, people that you're going to ridicule. You could be ridiculing them sympathetically, but the sense that they are lower than people nowadays in general. Key difference here again from the meanings of today. Often when in informal language today, if we say tragedy, that means, oh, it's a bad ending. That's not the case here. Tragedy here is about great characters, people who are better than us. And so even epic stories fall under this category of tragedy for him because these are about great heroes. Okay. Third, he has his difference in mode. And here's how he's going to differentiate epic from tragedy. Also different than what these words might mean to you. Epic for him is a story that's been narrated, especially by one narrator like Homer. I'm telling you a story, once upon a time. This is epic. Whereas action means something is acted out. Even shows you that the word act, drama is derived from the word for act or action, drama. So that epic, versus comedy before. See, epic and tragedy are both in that tragic side, in that there can be usually about better people, but within tragedy here, it depends on the mode, whether it's been narrated or acted out. Another little note he mentions later is that, because epic is narrated, the story can span over a long period of time. Whereas things that are acted out, his ideal is that it should be action that takes no longer than 24 hours. So that it's almost closer to real time. This is the ideal for Aristotle. Okay. Some of the background for where he comes up with that is not so clear, but what is clear is that he's following a logic here. Catharsis is a key word. Kenny doesn't use it in his translation here, but you see what he translates it as, and that's purification. It's often, and was once thought of as meaning to purge emotions. So he's defining tragedy as embellished language, distinct forms and different parts performed by actors rather than told by a narrator, affecting through pity and fear the purification of such emotions of pity and fear. So this is interesting. If you think about it as purifying emotions, when we're in tragedy, that might mean kind of understanding them almost. sharpening those emotions versus purging them would be, feeling them in some way that they're kind of being burnt off, released. So, there's a little bit of, dispute there over quite what that means. Um, but either way, I do sense a little bit of the kind of the medical background here of his family, and what is tragedy is defined almost by this function about what it does to the emotions, like the perspective of a doctor from the outside of the viewer, and say, oh, like what kind of effect is this object having on the viewer? Okay. Um, so in sum, the words poetry, tragedy, and epic don't have the same meanings in when we're talking about Aristotle as they do in our everyday language today. So be conscious of that. Um, the whole next lecture is going to be focused on what makes a good tragedy, an excellent tragedy, and that's going to be centered on plot.